In 1976, the city hired this group of consultants to do some major city planning. The consultants came up with this thing called the Team 4 plan. Out of the Team 4 plan, the suggestion was, well, don't do anything in North St. Louis. Let it rest. They called it the doctrine of benign neglect. Don't do anything for 30 years was the recommendation. And then come back and redevelop North St. Louis.
Back in 1916, when St. Louis had come up with an ordinance that was going to be segregation block by block. So no one could move into a block where 75% of one race lived on that block if you were another race.
One thing that's really interesting about St. Louis that's not so different than Boston is that it has a very small city, extremely small city, surrounded by suburbs. And those are different political jurisdictions, and they don't have the same resources, and they don't make decisions together. And that allows that's a kind of institutional or political institutional context that allows a social and economic and racial fragmentation. So there's a fragmentation in St. Louis, not just because blacks can't live with whites or because poor don't want to live with rich. There are institutional reasons that they live in different places, and it has to do with governance. And I think the governance structures have a lot to do with the history of the city. So the number one thing I would look at is how do you get people not just to be socially tolerant and care about the other, how do you introduce institutional practices, governance practices, money and programs that break down those social divides. So it's as much a spatial divide and a governance divide as it is a social divide.
Cities like St. Louis, that poverty is often concentrated poverty in the African American community, right? So over time, this neighborhood went from being sort of German, Jewish, Polish, Eastern European, transitioning to now the community is, I don't know what the Old North numbers are, but College Hill is 98% black.
Some people will downplay housing issues here because they're like, look at how cheap everything is and there's so much vacancy, and so maybe the problem is just people's income. I mean, we don't have to focus on housing, but I obviously disagree with that. There is a lot of housing, but it's also a lot of it is really low quality housing.
A lot of us feel sometimes that we just cannot sustain, maybe because lack of, I don't have that job, I don't have that security anymore, and I'm on this fixed income, and these bills are coming from everywhere. And it's a crisis when you can't pay your light bill and when you can't pay this bill, and it seems like everything come crashing in on you and everything gets broke at the same time that you get broke.
In a city like St. Louis, to get people to think about the public interest that really talks about the entire metro area, because people's lives are very much impacted, even if they're crossing in from the city into the county setting. They're all in the same terrain, right, to a certain degree. To get people to think about what it is that unites them, I think history is a great resource. Some might also say imagination about a future, but I think the historical kind of thinking about what are the common elements that could unite people, that they could come together behind, beyond the territories of the city and the county, or Ferguson versus another suburb. I grew up in Webster Groves. We don't talk about these other places in the city, but I do think having the imaginary of the city is a first step in starting a conversation that allows you to really define the public beyond the kind of fragmented interests of places.
When I was growing up, there were families everywhere. You know, people went to work, they came home, they had their kids outside. They all played together, practically grew up together. Of course, until another incident like this happened. So I guess as years go by, areas just decline. But I would rather not see everything turn into a park. You know, let's bring some families back out here. You guys can move here.